This episode contains descriptions of suicide as portrayed in James Cameron's film Titanic. Hey guys, thank you so much for tuning into Titanic Talkline. I am Alexia, your host, and I don't really want to take too much time. I kind of just want to get into this interview because it was super fun, so hope you enjoy listening as much as I enjoyed making. Welcome to the show that literally just started, 2 seconds ago? That's exciting.
The Utterly Formless Titanic podcast. Well, do you have a name for the podcast?
The podcast is Titanic Talkline.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, no, you sent me an email. It had the log line and everything like that. You're professional about this.
I'm trying.
Wait, so, okay. I guess we should establish, like, how old are you and when did you get into the Titanic? Like, what was your gateway into the Titanic stuff?
So,
like, what generation are you? Like, what's the context?
I'm an elder millennial. So I came...
So you're 30?
30s. I'm 33. I turned 33...
I don't want to dox you too. That's the other thing. Yeah, exactly.
My age isn't like... I know that some people are very sensitive about their age. I'm like, I'm 33. It's not exactly a secret if you want to look it up.
You're just a human being.
But, no, I'm 33. So the movie came out... I can't remember if I was 8 or 9 when the movie came out. Just math. But I saw James Cameron's Titanic, and I think... that's about the time. So two things happened in my life. Number one, I saw the movie and I thought it was really, really good. And it was also the first time that I, as a child, had seen a historical event presented in a modern day way. Like, these were actors I recognized. So now, all of a sudden, this isn't a historical event that happened, in the amorphous blob that is the past. It's something you can visualize, and you bond with the character.
Well, even when that stuff is presented in an old movie, too, that's still distancing. So if you're seeing, it's people you recognize with modern special effects and production quality and all that stuff.
Yeah, because, at the time, Leonardo DiCaprio was the heartthrob of the century, and if you just didn't know who he was, you were living under a rock.
Oh, God,
so even by the time the movie came out, even if you didn't know anything about Titanic, if you were in that age group, you were vaguely aware. And it was also making news at the time because it was going over budget, et cetera, et cetera.
See, that's the thing I always kept on hearing about, was just all the production stuff.
Yeah, but you weren't a middle school girl, so...
How do you know?
I don't.
What are you going to make them assumptions?
That is fair. I have just made a massive assumption.
You jerk. Just because I was like 25, back when Titanic was released, I was a 25-year-old white guy working his own job. But yeah, I was born in 1975, so I was 10 years old when they found the Titanic.
That is really cool.
And so...
because the Titanic's been found my whole life.
And I didn't really know anything about the Titanic until it made news, until, like, I think there was, like, an episode of, like, Leonard Nimoy's In Search Of, about the Titanic when I was a kid. Leonard Nimoy, when he wasn't doing Star Trek, he had this, like, Unsolved Mysteries type TV show where you would just talk about, like ancient alien...
That's
stuff
amazing.
And all kinds of weird mysteries and things like that. But one of the things was like, what happened to Titanic? Are they ever going to find it and stuff like that? And I maybe seen that, but like, yeah, it wasn't until I was asking you stuff. I should let you talk, but I just want to let you know that like that's my context, is that I'm an older guy.
But I think that's important because I recently went to a non-academic lecture called Titanic Disasters and the Titanic Mistakes, and it was a list of things that could have gone wrong leading up to the disaster. But I remember being struck by the professor who is, I have no idea how old he was, but I'm going to assume he's in his 60s. And he was saying that, he was already in academia by that time, and what an absolute game changer it was for someone who was already researching the Titanic and already trying to discover those things to all of a sudden have the real evidence that you've been looking for all this time right there. And it kind of made me understand that I was taking it a little for granted in that way, because it's always been around. I've always been able to verify the facts. Like, it was never a doubt that it split in half in my lifetime. They knew. It wasn't up for debate by that point in time.
I do remember, like, my context for that was, like, of course, they were talking about how it was split in half on the news and stuff like that. And right after that became a big deal, they must have republished the Walter Lord The Night Goes On book.
So.
Or Night to Remember, was that
yes,
the name of it?
The Night to Remember.
As a Titanic fan, I should know this. And then they put out a book, like, a year later, he wrote a quick sequel talking about all the information that he had gleaned since the discovery. And it was, like, as an 11-year-old, a year after they discovered it, it was interesting to see, to read Walter Lord writing about how all this, the discovery of the wreck changed the context of, like, everything he had written back in the 1950s when his first book came out. So that was my version of that, was to kind of still, but just, I never thought about being like an actual living professor, like an academic. How you're like that whole man.
Yeah, I hadn't.
I've only thought about fan impact and stuff.
Same.
Like that,
it hadn't occurred to me how devastating's not the word, but like, what is devastating in a positive way?
No, but still, it's sea
explosive.
change. Yeah,
it's brand new information, and it I imagine that it caused, at least at the time, maybe a lot of controversy among people, because the debate over whether or not that ship split in two had been going on since the sinking, when a bunch of women and children who were in the lifeboats are saying, hi, that ship split in two, and everyone else was like, no, it did not.
It was funny because, like, going back to the Walter Lord thing too, because he spends half that book talking about, okay, that ship split in half, and even he talks about how that barely even got mentioned. Like, to him, it wasn't even a debate, because it was something that a couple people claimed, but then again, so many people claimed so many weird things that night that nobody really paid attention. Just like the idea that, like, oh, there's at least one guy who dressed like a woman to get in the boats and stuff like that. Things you kind of, like, hear people say, but you don't really take it seriously. Right. And I guess the cracking of the ship in half was, like, one of those things. And, like, part of that book, I think it was As the Night Goes On. No,
A Night to Remember.
It was the sequel. The original one was A Night to Remember. The second book, which was the one I'm talking, it was The Night Lives On. He talks about, okay, now it's time we have to go back and reevaluate like what those people that we've been like, especially he himself had ignored in his original book. And it's like, okay, like sometimes, even the quote unquote experts get proven wrong. So I always thought it was kind of interesting. Also, I know this is a test recording that we're doing, but in case this ever gets out, I don't want to make it seem like I was making light of people and their gender affirmation stuff. I just want to throw that out. This is an accepting place. I'm assuming
it is an accepting place. I am.
So I want to make sure that, like, don't be white guys making fun of identity stuff, because I take that seriously.
I think though that's kind of important to address, because part of what happened in the wake of the sinking, I've been reading this book called Down with the Old Canoe. I don't remember the subtitle, but something like The Cultural History of the Disaster, by Stephen Beale. And in it, he talks about how after the ship sank, it was used as a way to really raise up and extol white men, and to really squash down the narrative of others. Like, I think at the time there was a comic published, I believe it might have been of Archibald, but in like he's dressed in a suit holding a gun and holding it on a bunch of third-class passengers, and the caption is something like, Sir Archibald Butt holds a gun to prevent Italian third-class passengers from boarding lifeboats.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of sort of that happening, and I think that it's kind of important to acknowledge that there was a lot of really negative misogyny and xenophobia that this disaster unfortunately gave people, the wrong people, an opportunity to use in their favor. Like, there were even people quoted as saying, it's such a shame that some of these third-class women lived when, the great minds of billionaires went down instead. It's like,
yeah.
And that was said out loud. They said the quiet part right out loud.
Well, and like, even with the rumors that there was, like, supposedly a guy dressed as a woman got into the boats, because I guess a couple Asian people survived. There's been like
6 Chinese.
I'm trying to figure out, did they misinterpret their dress as being like, if they were wearing whatever, like, just because it was not normal to Western eyes, they just assumed it was a woman in a dress, and like all kinds of shit like that. And it was, I just one of the things that got me into Titanic stuff again was there's I can't remember how I heard about it, but there was someone that recommended me, there was a big new Titanic book that just came out within the last couple of years. On a Sea of Glass.
Yeah, I just got my copy the other day.
Be the new. And I just finished reading that, and that's one of the first Titanic books where within the text itself it actually talks about, not a ton, but it talks about some of the racism even before the sinking happened, because he even talks about how I think it was a whole bunch of people who wrote that book, but the authors had specifically highlighted like one moment where there was a lady waiting in line for the purser's office, and some guy in front of her turns around and says, like, those Jews in front of us taking their time, or something like that. And that's the first time I've ever seen anyone actually writing a book about Titanic. Just talk about the casual racism of the time. Not even regarding, like, class issues in the boats and who survived and stuff, but just, like... So it was interesting just to see that kind of stuff. And,
because Stephen Beale addressed...
It was 1912,
and
Fuck.
Stephen Beale goes into really good detail. Like, the whole book is about the culture at the time. It's less about the thinking. So he...
The Down with the Old Canoe?
Down with the Old Canoe. I think I have Google literally right in front of me. I am at a computer.
If you heard me typing, that's because I was looking it up.
I have the loudest keyboard ever, which is why I was trying not to type. But
you got one of those clicky-clacky 1980s. Yeah.
It wasn't even on purpose. I've had it for a long time.
Sound like you're hacking the Matrix.
Hold on 1 second.
No, take your time.
We're in.
Oh, you mean you're making a joke? I see.
Yes, it's called Down with the Old Canoe: A Cultural History of the
I
Titanic.
read this back in the day.
Yeah.
Because
it's really, really good.
Okay. I was thinking about, because again, getting into this Titanic stuff, I was thinking about old books I'd read like maybe 20 years ago, and I think that's one of. Okay.
Yeah, it came out about 20 years ago, 2003.
Shit. Yeah, I think I'll let you talk.
Well, it's a really good book, and I think that it's one of those things where we don't think about how the narrative may have been shaped for us when you recount the story. Because, for example, one thing that the book had to point out to me that I just didn't think about was that Isidore and Ida Strauss were basically made honorary Anglo-Saxons, as he said in his book, in The Sinking, to kind of extol them and lift them up, and they basically had to be reclaimed by the Jewish community, who were like, no, those are ours. Could you stop that, please?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And it's that sort of thing that happened.
I didn't even think about in the last 20 years all the different kinds of more actual writings like that. Because I've been out of the loop for 20 years. I didn't even think about all the advancements. Maybe the last thing I read was maybe this Down with the Old Canoe book, and I thought that was interesting 20 years ago, but I didn't even think about how more people would have built on top of it. Okay, that's cool.
I would actually be really interested if he or someone else would do a follow-up, 20 years in the future, what we've now learned culturally since then. Because I remember... Going back to the question you asked me a while ago, which is how I got into Titanic, was one, not minor, but one plot point really caught my attention when I was watching it, and that was the fate of First Officer Murdoch. And I remember, being a kid and watching, and I don't even know if when I was that age I knew what suicide was. I don't know that I did.
Yeah, because you said you were
8 or 9, right?
That is a wild concept, especially that comes out of the blue in that movie.
It does, and I think and that was shocking for me because it was like, this man has been doing everything so right. He's helping everybody, and it was an accident. What happened? Because if you don't remember, somebody jumps into the crowd, which forces the crowd to surge forward, which he mistakes as men rushing the boat, so he shoots. And it turns out that's not what happened. But then he feels guilt, salutes an officer, and shoots himself in the head. And I remember just sitting in the theater I wanted to pause and be like, somebody needs to explain this to me. I was really upset. Because I just didn't get it.
I can see that being a life... maybe life-changing moment is a little bit much to say, but that's one of those things in a pop culture thing that dents you when you're a kid, and you're like, what the hell was that?
That didn't make sense.
I could totally empathize with
that. Right, you've been doing all the right things, you've been saving so many people, you don't have time to be sorry for yourself, the boat's going down.
So how'd that affect your,
that, interestingly enough, that stuck with me, and it also stuck with me in that's a fact way. I'm one of those people that was just like, wow, isn't that so sad what happened to that man? And... It kind of always stuck with me that scene and the rest of the emotional impact of that movie is what kind of made me realize how not only impactful fiction is, but how you can weave in history to make it feel relevant again. And that was a big moment for me. And I was also very fortunate to have the best English teacher I'd had in my entire teaching life at that time, who really encouraged my reading and my writing. And I'm neurodivergent. I'm unusual. I didn't have a lot of friends, so having that interest was very important. And it came back around. I don't remember how old I was when Cameron issued the apology, where he acknowledged that by taking that creative liberty, I know there's some debate as to who it was, were there gunshots, et cetera, but, Cameron...
Or even if there was a suicide.
Exactly, but Cameron himself even acknowledged, I was just a filmmaker making a story, and I thought it was a good story. I didn't even think of how that might affect his legacy. And that brought it all back to me, where it was like, that was a reaffirmation of how important fiction can be. That I just assumed that was a fact, and that shifted that again to where it was like, fiction is powerful. Storytelling is powerful. It is connective, and it brings people together, and that's ultimately why I wanted to start the show, because I think that, as I said in the beginning, it keeps it keeps the story alive, it keeps the interest going, but it also just helps people connect. And especially when talking to, fans, everyone has their own kind of reason for liking Titanic, whether it's just because it was a pretty movie or if they have an emotional story. And when you let people just talk about why they like something and how it impacted them, you learn a lot.
It tells the story of itself.
It does.
Why they're drawn
right. And so, for me, it's not because I found a piece of steel and was like, this is neat. What can it make? Like, that wasn't it for me. For me, it was like, wow, what a sad story. Hang on, that might not all be true. And then when I went and researched it more, it was like, hang on, Murdoch might have been responsible for saving up to 75% of the passengers because he, women, and children firsted, not only.
The on the Sea of Glass book too, they have a little chapter at the end, a little epilogue where they talk about like, okay, if there was a suicide on the ship, who would have been? And they're talking about the case for Murdoch. And I didn't even realize because like I went back and rewatched the movie after reading the book because like they also pointed out like one of the big cases for it, if someone did commit suicide, it being Murdoch, was he was the commanding officer in charge when the ship hit the iceberg. So not only do you have the fact that he just may have accidentally just shot a couple people, but he's also, like, he's got the weight of the fact that everything's happening. He might be thinking, like, this is his fault. And so that is an extra kind of horror that never even occurred to me, even though I've seen it in the movie a bunch of times. I've read everything about the disaster. It never really sunk in that, like, oh shit, yeah, that's also, like, ooh. And yeah, this is all interesting because, like, you going back to the James Cameron having to issue an apology to his family and stuff like that. That's one of my favorite things about history is the fact that, like, because it's history and most history is distant enough that, there's no living people left around from who witnessed that history. So you have to kind of piece together everything after the events have happened. And so you have anyone who's serious about learning about history has to learn that, like, who's telling the story is a story in of itself, and like the politics of this kind of goes back to what you're saying, like the politics of all this stuff too. It's like, yeah, whose story is being, I mean, I guess this is the whole point of the Hamilton thing, is like who tells your story and why, and how, who's the story being told to, and what pieces are being left out, and like that becomes an interesting kind of like sleuth thing going on there too. And it's mysteries and stories on top of mysteries and stories, and God, yeah, it's all just a big tangle of just humanity and storytelling. And
it is. And I don't want to sound like weird and pedantic when I say I love the, grand tradition of oral storytelling. But I think that especially with history, that kind of stuff is important because we don't, as you said, we don't have the, survivors anymore. We only have their descendants or the descendants of the victims. And we only learn about those people by, tracing the conversation backwards through history.
And, like, stuff like the ship breaking in half, too. That's point example there where, like, that's something that happened that everyone just kind of brushed off, even though, like, a decent number of people were like, that ship broke in half. And everyone just kind of ignored it. So, if, like, but if historians can get something, and that's one kind of going back to Walter Lord, him going like, oh man, like, I totally misunderestimated what these people were talking about. If you can get something like that wrong, imagine how much other stuff you take for granted is true about there's still true about what we still think is true about the sinking of the Titanic that we probably get wrong too. But like, yeah, and that just applies to all kinds of historical, not just Titanic.
I think it's really funny though, because I remember when I was younger and learned that fact about, the women and children who had been off the ship for the longest time and were watching it go down. They all said that they saw the ship sink. And I mean, break in half and then sink. And I remember thinking, like, why are they believing them? There's so many of them? And then it just hit me. It's like, oh, women in 1912. Yeah. Natch. They were all hysterical, grief-stricken, I'm sure. I haven't gotten this far in the book yet, but just considering as a loose matter the concept of believing women not really being at the forefront of people's priority list at the time. And I think I saw a theory that said that part of the reason they might have tried to rearrange that narrative about the ship not breaking in half was that it would be really bad for White Star Line, which I understand that, you don't want to be seen as our ship's just but I think this was a pretty extraordinary circumstance.
Yeah, it's the of all the things to happen that night, the ship breaking in half is like, yeah,
it's not unimportant.
Still, the people died. It doesn't really matter if the ship broke in half at some point or not.
I agree with you, because at the end of the day, whether it split in half or split in thirds or went down all in one piece, it's like X number of people died. And their descendants aren't sitting at home going, thank God, I might have lost my husband and my sons, but it did split in two.
That's the kind of thing only the hardcore Titanic nerds really care about. Is like that kind of stuff.
I care about it in the sense that it's accurate, but I care about it less because for me, what I find interesting about Titanic is the human elements of it all. It's like, yeah, it's split in half, or I love learning facts about how it was built, or the technology. It's all neat, and I think that's very fun to learn. But I'm more interested personally in, like I said, that element of humanity and like how it was. For many people, it was, their ticket to a new life. For many people, it was not a good thing.
The drama of the whole... Oh, that's kind of the funny thing about the Titanic. It's a little... I don't want to say it's unique, but there's not a lot of disasters where there's so much, like, the technical aspect plus the drama aspect... versus even the archaeological aspect of like exploring the wreck and stuff like that. I can see why the Titanic fandom is a little nutso, a little kind of split in kind of multiple ways, because you're gonna have the rivet heads who really only care about like the kind of the ship aspects, and then you have the people who really only care about the drama stuff. And like I could see why there might be extra gatekeeping within a fandom like that, because I'm sure you have, some of the older folks, regardless even what part of the fandom they're into, like probably gatekeeping gets the people who only got into Titanic because of the movie and stuff like that. But
there is a lot of hate for that, and I
which I don't want to say it's justified, but I'm a naturally hateful person.
Same.
I can understand that. I can empathize even if I don't agree. But at the same time, they're still into Titanic. Let those people alone. This is cool. Whatever. As long as you guys all have the same interest.
Being one of those, because I am one of those people, and I think that the argument I want to give to those people is, how else in that year, in that time when I was that age, did you want me to find Titanic? That is my question to the world. Like, all right.
And those are the people who just want to keep it to themselves, though, because they think it's just their hobby, and they want to make it like an elitist weird thing, which is, it's weird, because suddenly you're turning to a first-class passenger on the Titanic, where you're stratifying the fandom into classes and treating the ones, quote-unquote, below you as lesser than.
And that's what I think is silly.
You're reenacting the event. Maybe that's much to say that, like, the people who got into the Titanic because of the movie are the third-class passengers. Drowning below decks. But,
Maybe.
But it's still like, don't be a jerk.
I mean, most of us are millennials, and we are kind of being just massively stomped on by the world, so...
Well, that's the other thing, too.
And that's what frustrates me, is that I understand gatekeeping if someone is just being fucking rude or wrong.
That's what I'm saying. As a naturally hateful person, I could at least understand like that. Just kind of like, you're just not.
Yeah, you're just coming in defensive for no reason. You're like, nah, Jack and Rose were real, and fuck you if you don't believe. It's like, okay, you need to go.
Where's Jack Skellington? Have you found Jack Skellington yet?
If he were as tall as Jack Skellington, he might have actually been able to just stand on the ocean floor and
I love the idea they go to, and they actually find out he's actually there with Sally and
there was
Zero
that
the
scene
dog.
in James and the Giant Peach where they go underwater and Jack Skellington is the captain of the ship.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I forgot about that. Yeah. I've not seen that in theaters, but I do remember that.
Theory. Yeah. Somebody plotted out.
I can't believe I actually called him Jack Skellington. I didn't even mean
But I did.
God, anyway.
It was fun, though.
Freudian slip. I want to bone Jack Skellington.
Jack Skellington is a little mopey for me, but great singing voice.
Yeah,
down for a great singer.
It's funny how much he sounds like Danny Elfman.
I mean, but I think the love of movies for a lot of people who are in the Titanic fandom, not even just the Cameron film, but there is a lot of other Titanic movies. They're
all terrible.
I haven't seen them.
I've tried to see them, and like they're dumb. Like there's a Nazi one.
I've heard that exists. What is that?
I've only seen the clips, and I'm not in the mood to be watching any Nazi Titanic movies these days. But Oh my god. Well, no, I think I think maybe they changed it so it's technically not a Titanic movie, but I think it is like it's either that or like the Titanic gets saved by like a German ship or
I
something
know that
like
there
that.
is
It was
one.
obviously it was Nazi propaganda, but it was all like
I heard about it because my favorite Titanic podcast is Unsinkable, the Titanic podcast with host L.A. Beatles, and she posted an episode recently that was like, my husband and I watched the Nazi Titanic film, and I was just like, you what?
that's something you just say out of the blue to strangers. Hey, you know that Nazi Titanic.
Right, it was just like, I'm sorry, I thought I was having a normal day. What did I just read?
I'm sorry, I'm typing. I need to look up. I love that we're recording a podcast about Titanic, and now I'm taking notes
Nazi
about
Titanic films.
podcasts I should listen to. But okay, Unsinkable.
She's
Okay,
really
just
good. I
looking
like
at
her. She does a more like the scripted fact-based approach, but
Okay,
I really obviously I like her, and she has one of those.
Oh, so it's kind of like well, who's the lady who does the Join me, won't you? You may
I
not
don't know who that is.
Katrina Longworth. She's the wife of the guy who did Ryan Johnson, who did The Last Jedi and Knives Out. Shut up, Bill. I'm gonna let you talk.
I don't know. These are interesting things. I also like Star Wars.
I can ramble because if you can ramble, I can ramble, and we
gonna be
can
a
start
thing.
rambling. This at least stops being about a Titanic altogether.
Fair
We're talking
enough,
about
but
like as someone who like I haven't been into the Titanic fandom in 20 years, but every spring I do end up every April 15th I end up watching the Titanic movie. Even though I'm not a big fan of the movie, but still, what else are you gonna do?
It's the current. It is the current Titanic film.
Yeah, I mean, and I can't imagine anything topping it anytime soon because that's such
It would be
a
very
once in a
hard.
generation. Maybe 50 years from now, somebody will come in and try to outdo it. One of my favorite Titanic anecdotes, which the last time we'll talk about Star Wars, is there's a little bit in one of the behind the scenes documentaries of making. I think it's the Phantom Menace, the first prequel one that came out in 1999, and I think they're in the middle of filming in 1998. And everyone's hanging out with George Lucas behind the scenes. I can't remember what scene they're filming, but everyone's talking about like how well the movie might do, how well the Phantom Menace is going to do in the box office. And everyone's like, "Well, it's going to be Titanic," because Titanic had just come out, and like everyone's like, "Yeah, it's like, how's this not going to become the number one?"
Right, that's
picture
a
of all time?
romance
Everyone's
movie on a
waiting for
boat.
And like Lucas is the one who comes out and he says like, "I don't think we're going to be Titanic. I think it's Titanic was such like a huge thing that he just points out that like." Also, he just points out that like Star Wars movies can fail because he even talks about like. But anyway, like the idea that it was George Lucas himself, the guy making this new Star Wars movie in 1998, being all like, "Oh yeah, no, I don't. I think this movie will do well, but I don't think we're gonna beat Titanic because Titanic was such a juggernaut, such a once in a generation thing that even a new Star Wars movie isn't gonna be." And he was absolutely correct. Titanic was number one until fucking Avatar. You gonna start an Avatar
We're not going to
podcast
talk about
now?
Avatar. Which is disappointing because I love Zoe Saldana. I saw behind the wonderful.
Yeah.
I saw a behind the scenes clip from TikTok the other day. I don't have TikTok. I just watched them that posted on Facebook where someone posted a side by side comparison of the scene where Natiri confronts Jake. Jake, I think is his name. She's like, "You lied to me, you lied to me," and she's really angry.
Oh yeah.
But then they show her, Zoe, doing the acting, and she is heartbroken. She is upset.
Yeah.
You see it in her face. She looks like she's going to cry. She's like, I can't, no. You hear her voice breaking, and you're like, and I think the caption for the TikTok was, "Oh, she was acting under that," but it's not to say she didn't give a good performance, but it obscurates.
No, but it's still a little,
the little
yeah,
things.
something about it just doesn't quite.
Right, like you don't quite get the tremor of the lip. You don't get the tear.
The main thing I care about the new Avatar movies is that at least Zoe
Came
Saldana
back.
and some actors got a paycheck out
love
of it.
her.
Oh, and none of them seem to have drowned, so at least
That's
that's
good.
going for them. But yeah, so.
It's interesting though, because going back to like if they had done CG with Titanic, I think of the scenes where CG was used, and I wonder if it could only enhance them, because they seemed mostly to be used in transitory capacities. But then again, that's because they had real footage to zoom in and out of, so I wonder, that's probably a moot point.
That one, the big shot of the movie where it's the ship sailing off for the first time, and it's the King of the World thing where like it's right after King of the World where the camera just racks across the whole length of the ship, and you get to see all the people walking around. It's the one big beauty shot in the movie that is like the one they really spent all their time and money on. That was beautiful in 1997. These days,
Oh, it's a little rough.
It's not terrible, But like the people are obviously like little PlayStation people,
and they're kind
on
of
the
floating
ship
in
and stuff.
some places. Like they're
which is not bad. But that's one of the things, because we live in a world that's still soaked with CGI. I think there's something that's more offensive to the eye about bad CGI than like bad practical effects from before the CGI era, because it just assumed that everything would look kind of weird to begin with. But like they're so close to being so photorealistically perfect that just being off. I mean, everyone talks about the uncanny valley, but like that is still like
it's the one big part that I think, like you said, when you watch it in this day and age, you're like, you giggle a little.
And that's the one thing I would be even if they just went back and re-rendered those effects. I don't have to reshoot. I would be fascinated to see James Cameron do a. God, it's James Cameron. He's gonna
do that.
Edition.
Just redo that.
He's gonna do it someday.
Well, because the thing is, this is the 25th and.
It's gotta be. Is it?
This is the.
It is. Yeah,
and it's the.
Because that was 1997 to 2022.
And it's the 110th. This year is the 110th of the sinking. So I'm imagining they'll do something at some point.
And 10 years from now, or 20 or something, like one of those anniversaries. Maybe another 25 years. But you know what? I want my Titanic remake, because there's always that meme goes around, like we'll take a movie and replace all the characters
Muppets.
but one with Muppets. I want Cal to be the only human in a Muppet remake.
I have a feeling that Billy Zane would love that. I don't know him,
because he is totally.
But it seems like he put himself in a movie that Ben Stiller yelled, "Put a cork in it, Zane." So
yeah, that's. Billy Zane always felt to me like the one person who really understood kind of the melodramatic movie that he was in. Like, not to say everyone, like, I like people in Titanic, but Billy Zane is such a cartoon.
Have you seen the behind-the-scenes footage where he uses his cane to knock someone's top hat off and then they, like, Jedi joust for a second?
No,
it's really
I didn't see
good.
That. I did see, someone just posted to Reddit the other day of, I guess Billy Zane just found his behind-the-scenes
They were so
Polaroids.
cute.
That is goddamn cute. Especially him, part of me was like, oh, he and Kate Winslet seem to get along
they look
fine.
like they're
I was
friends.
like, okay, that made me very happy.
There's one where she's leaning over and just like licking his cheek like an obnoxious person, like bleh.
Yeah, and like they totally they look like kids hanging out.
There's a few
something like they look very cute. And he had a very cool like photo of her on the deck of the ship at dusk. And I was like, okay, that's actually a fucked up cool photograph to have. That is actually
somebody
a piece of
posted about that saying like he should get that blown up and printed out because it's just an objectively good photo. One thing I learned by reading Veronica Hincke's book and listening to her interview on Unsinkable was like the thought that had never crossed my mind is that like women's clothing for upper class women was designed to be put on by somebody else. Like Rose wouldn't have even been able to take off her own fucking clothes because of however it was fastened or sealed or whatever the case may be. So it's like that level of control.
There is a corset scene in that movie, right?
Yeah,
there is a corset scene. Like, that's legally obligated. If you have a movie that takes place before, like, 1920, like, you gotta have...
The corset yank.
Hold on to the banister, there's a, maid help you.
Yeah, the Scarlett O'Hara moment. But it's just interesting when you think about it, because, I mean, obviously, I'm wearing a t-shirt right now. It's not a big deal. But if I literally had to wait for someone to put on and take off my clothes, I would be so mad, just day in and day out. Yeah. That just restricts everything you can do, and that stuff did not look comfortable to sit in either. So it's just like, they make it so you can't run, they give you no options, you have no education, you are married off when you are 16, 17. That's it.
I don't know how you would live through that.
I don't either.
I mean that speaks to my own privilege as a white guy living in the 21st century. And I'm just like, shit, man, like. And then people wonder why people like that goddamn movie, the Titanic movie. It's because, like, I mean, there's plenty of like made for TV Lifetime movies about like, female freedom and shit like that, but like I do not blame women for being like, holy shit, here's like a major blockbuster movie about just the most basic shit about being a lady in modern society, even though it was like just modern from a century ago. But like, and then like all these dudes are so confounded, like, why do you like that movie? Why is this so popular? It's just like, it's half the population of the planet. All you have to do is like do the most basic thing to serve them, and they'll be happy. And they'll be, I mean, maybe not. I mean, not everyone's gonna be shit slappingly happy about it and like have no problems with it. But like, yeah, come on, just like fucking give them throw them a bone. Jesus Christ.
Yeah, it's just, I think that goes back to that gatekeeping again, where some people are just determined to keep things the way that it is, and unfortunately that
That's especially the gendered
Yeah.
gatekeeping around that movie is especially
It's
just
bonkers.
come on, dude.
Because I think Cameron himself said that it was like the movie is about Rose. It's a feminist story. It's about a young girl choosing her own destiny. And that's really important. As you said, there was a major blockbuster film that featured a female main character who, literally spits in the face of
I guess she
literally spits in the face of her old life and says, "I don't want this."
Is that Cal?
Yes, it
she
is.
spits into it? Has to be, right? Okay, yeah. It wasn't her mom. Again,
No.
it's funny because I watch that movie every spring, but it shows how much of that movie actually retains in my
She's
brain.
running from the boat and her mom is screaming her name, and then Cal grabs her and is like,
Oh, that's right. And I think that's the last time she probably actually even communicates with Cal, right? Because after that,
it's the last.
Is that literally the last thing she
No,
does?
it's the last time she. That scene is interesting to me as an adult because I now realize that is the last scene where she sees her mother.
Okay,
Cal
that's what
sees
it
her
is. Because
again.
I remember something. It's
Cal
okay.
sees
Yeah.
her again, and then there's the revolver.
That's
and
one of the weirdest parts of that movie is her relationship with her mom, and
Yeah.
if that's the last time she sees her mom.
That to me
yeah.
was why it was because the whole movie you watch and you don't particularly think that Ruth cares about Rose. But in those moments, what did it for me was when the lifeboat started lowering and you see Rose running away and you hear her screaming her name. Not just Rose, but she's screaming like a mother calling for her child.
Yeah.
Screaming hysterically for her daughter.
And presumably not just because Rose is her
No,
meal
because she's her
ticket, but
daughter.
because she actually... It's her
At the
daughter.
end of the day, I know some people might see that as, oh, she just didn't want her to get away. I'm maybe choosing to read it positively because this woman is realizing that if her daughter runs away, there is an exceptionally high probability she will die. And this is literally her trying to save her daughter's life. And she can't. And I think...
I need to go back and rewatch. I need to do like a mom... Rose's mom's movie rewatch of that movie just to focus on her and see
Because it's really...
Because, it doesn't help that, right before that, when she's getting into the boat, she's like,
Well, the lifeboat
boat's
seated according to class.
It's just like, okay. You know what? Actually, her mom would probably be way more sympathetic in that movie if you just delete that one line, because that is so
I also
just
think
like...
that keeping it in was kind of important because it just shows that is you thought. That is how you thought. That is just how you thought. Like, you said the quiet part out loud. And it was normal.
Yeah. And, yeah. It's, and it feels like, I think one of our problems with that line is that it feels more like James Cameron just being like, oh, rather than the character. I mean, it makes sense for the character to say that too, but it seems a little bit almost like even too arch for that character a little bit, but yeah.
I don't disagree. I guess it also really depends on, like, where in the timeline of the sinking were they? Was it still when the ship was level and everyone was like, not a big deal? Not a big deal.
Because it seems like they get into the boats pretty early.
Because... Oh, yeah, I remember what happened because Ruth makes that joke, and then Rose grabs her immediately by the shoulder and just shakes her.
Oh, that's when she really turns against the mom.
That is when they have that moment, and she was like, don't you understand? Half the people on the ship are going to die.
And that's the one thing Cameron does to make Rose smarter than everyone else is by making her buddies with Thomas Andrews. Is that she has that insider information, so she's like the one person on the boat other than the captain and Thomas Andrews.
Yeah, and that was also very important.
Which that's a little bit of editorializing too, where it's like it's not realistic that she would probably know that, even if she was like buddies with Thomas Andrews. But like, it's funny that like he's her like Titanic uncle on the ship. So
I read something somewhere, and maybe it was in A Night to Remember, where apparently a survivor claimed to have heard like him saying that to somebody, and so Cameron was like, well, I'm just gonna make that somebody Rose, it's like I don't know if that would necessarily happen, but I think that
it's not entirely impossible, because it seems like Thomas Andrews was a pretty
honest,
like responsible guy, and he would try to at least get that information out without trying to cause
the accounts that I see referring to him seem to be along that line, where he was like, I'm not going to cause a panic, but I'm not going to lie to people. But I think
that on the Sea of Glass book that I just finished, it's like crazy. I was expecting if any book is going to dig up anything about Thomas Andrews, like kicking puppies or something like that, that would have been the book. And even that book is consistently Thomas Andrews was a saint. So I was like, okay, I guess maybe he was
A good
legitimately
person.
cool and like.
It sounded
yeah,
like he was. All accounts say that he treated the people who worked for him, regardless of status, very well, and I'm sure that he had his own issues being a part of the upper class. I'm sure he wasn't a literal
I'm
saint.
sure if you saw a black person, he'd run.
Yeah, I
you
mean,
wouldn't want to hear what he had to say.
Right, or if
but,
someone
like,
had said gay around him, he might have fainted. But
it's,
like,
oh god, yeah, exactly. But within the scale of what we're talking
exactly.
about, yeah.
And going back
Yeah.
to
To the point that whenever I see that actor
Victor
now,
Garber,
I was like, oh,
I
it's
love
Tom
Victor Garber,
Sanders.
national
Yeah.
treasure, Victor Garber.
I didn't know he was gay. Not that it matters for anything like that, but like, I was like, oh, Tom Sanders is gay.
I love him.
But
I think that moment with Ruth and Rose, because that is their last interaction. I remember the scene pretty well because she says half the people are going to die, and then Cal says not the better half, and that is when they have that conversation. But by this time, Molly Brown has like ushered Ruth into the boat and is trying to get Rose to come in. And after she and Cal have had that exchange and she realized what happened, that's when she starts backing away. But by now, Ruth has heard what Rose had said, and so even though the boat doesn't seem like it's sinking, she's heard.
She's gotten that information.
So
she
now
knows
even though it may not seem like the boat is sinking, people aren't panicking yet. She knows that Rose running back into that ship means she'll probably never see her again, and she doesn't.
That's the best thing about the story is that like it's so multifaceted. We'll draw so many people from so many different backgrounds for so many different reasons that there's no one reason why everyone's drawn to the Titanic. But it's just like human Rorschach test.
Yeah,
like where it's just you kind of bring your own baggage with it. That's what if there's any one benefit to that movie coming out, is just the breadth of crazy shit like that came out.
One thing that I didn't think about was that obviously this was Titanic's maiden voyage, but people would keep things intentionally, like little napkins or note cards or menus, because it had the White Star Line and Titanic branding as something to be able to be like, hey, look at this thing. Yeah, and so that's how many of them survived. I think that someone pointed out that one of the officers had like his lunch menu still in his pocket just from earlier in the day. So these yeah, but unfortunately, like now everything's digital, but it doesn't seem as though the White Star Line kept, these archives of those things, because outside of the few that exist, it's not like they are able to go back and be like, here is the printing block for, Wednesday's first class dinner. Like they just don't have that.
Especially with the White Star Line being sold off eventually and stuff like that. Even if they did have an archive,
yeah,
probably
and
got
also
scattered.
but at the time, probably, thinking about being a person in 1915, for example, trying to move on from the Titanic disaster, I don't think many.
That's true. If you're working for the White Star Line, there's no reason to hang on to Titanic stuff because I didn't even think about that part. Yeah,
the same way that after Carpathia arrived in New York, people just like vultured the lifeboats for paraphernalia. It's the same thing.
It never occurred to me because, while reading that book, getting towards the end of the book, on the Sea of Glass thing, I was like, what did... And, they actually, of course, they answer the question. It was like, people just, ripped off, because I guess there were, Titanic name placards on the boats, and people just ripped them off. But then the boats just, rotted in a warehouse for, 5 years, and no one knows what happened after that.
It's that kind of thing where, again, now in 2022, we think, why didn't they save those? They're so important. But at the time, it's like, we just had a big fucking disaster. Yeah. How do we recover from this? Somebody come up with a plan. It's like, they weren't thinking of how to...
Well, it's about, asking someone now, why didn't you hang on to your 9/11 newspaper or something, Although I guess there's a decent number of people who did hang on to that because we live in such a collector's culture now. But back in the day,
Well, not only that, but it was less collecting, and I think especially at the, maybe it's me assuming things, but manufacturing and etc. was new. So I think there was a very different interest in consumption and less keeping, because obviously now we realize, it's not that people never kept stuff.
Well, there wasn't quite as much of the middle class with everyone owning their own home. Well, there's not that much of a middle class now with everyone owning their own home. But, we already lived past that bubble. That was less than a century of the American middle class. But, there wasn't quite...
that was another thing that I remember thinking about that hadn't occurred to me either, is that for many of the people who did survive, they lost everything. You didn't have a bank with your credit card. You can't just go get a credit card.
When thinking about how did Rose live? What was her first meal when she... again, Rose is pretend, but that's a good way to think about, how did you... If you were just... How did you survive
Afterwards.
just for the 24 hours after you stepped off the Carpathia?
I read a book called The Girl Who Came Home by Hazel Gaynor, and it's a historical...
You got a mind for this shit. You should be working at a library.
That's all. It's not like I read these 20
yeah.
years ago. But she created, a fictional young woman who manages to survive the sinking. She's the only one out of her group who is. And they were based on a real group out of Ireland called the Outergool 14. It was 14 people from one small city in Ireland who all went on Titanic together, and I actually don't know if any of them survived, but I think maybe one or two. But in this book, the girl Maggie, she gets, spoiler alert for anyone who's about to read this book, skip. But if she gets to New York and she has family, she has a sister who can take her in, who has like a spare room for her. It's not much, but for a lot of these people, they were coming there to meet relatives, so I imagine that's what it is. But yeah, for someone like Rose who now has nothing, I've often wondered about that too. Like, I imagine there was probably some sort of like first aid relief just set up for everyone.
Yeah, the Sea of Glass thing did talk about how people, like, the White Star Line did raise,
Victim relief.
like, some funds to help out people. Although God knows how many of that went to actually poor people, and just, like, who again, it's 1912, who knows how that stuff was actually distributed to anybody who wasn't already kind of like a middle-class or rich white guy, but yeah... Yeah, like, especially as a lady by herself in New York with only like a giant billion-dollar diamond,
which she never does anything with,
like, besides
hide it for her whole life.
Yeah, I'm glad to see she's got a life outside of Titanic.
I think that was really cool too. I mean, and again, this is all speaking of like her character being fictional, but it's like it's also a very privileged voice.
That's the one of the things, and like, but people use that as a hammer to fuck up the women who like that movie. Where it's like, oh, you just like the rich white girl. And it's like, no, like, this is kind of what we were talking about before, about how, like, the conflict of, like, telling the story of a woman, but she's also rich and white. But, like, I'm going to shut up and let you talk. I'm sorry.
I mean, the whole point of a conversation is two people.
I get excited about things, yeah.
But it's like,
oh, man, she's so pretty.
And that was...
It's man, what I think about that movie, the more entertaining it is. Just like even talk, I don't get a chance to talk about that movie with anyone. Who could like, God, shut up.
But it's also and going back to why I liked it. For me, I'm a visual person, and being able to see Titanic in color. Was helpful to illustrate how grand it was, because you see it in black and white, and it's really hard to see the details in the paneling and like stairs. Man, everything looks, it's just what. But then you see that he's rebuilt it, and then the scene where Jack walks into the first class dining room and he pans up and you see that whole glass ceiling. It's like that was such a pretty place.
Is that the glass ceiling? Is that the same? Is that the first class dining room you later see a dead body floating in later on? Because they keep... Can
I also tell you that scene, when it happened in the theater, I don't remember where that came. I don't know if that came before the suicide or after, but that scene
That's another
shocked
thing,
because
it's just the corpse of a beautiful lady
she's
just
dead.
floating. And they make sure to showcase that lighting fixture a couple times, just so when you see it later, it's like, oh, like, it's so distinctive that it's just such a nice grace note towards the end of that movie.
Now that you mention it, I don't think that was the grand skylight, but I know that there was more than one sort of like glass ceilinged area. Yeah. But the big one, which was the dome on top of the grand staircase, hadn't filled up by that point.
Man.
But yeah, that scene freaked me out because when I was younger, it's a young woman with long hair and wearing a long dress, and for just like one hot second, you think, "Oh my God, is that Rose?"
Yeah, I could see that. Yeah. And that's just...
I don't know if I was the only one who thought that, but I did for a second.
Like that corpse is definitely done out to be very, very kind of ghostly. Like it's you get the effect.
There's a reason.
It's supposed to be,
Yeah, and then there's just this like dull strings underneath, just playing this slow dirge sounding thing, and then it immediately cuts to I think it's the plates just smashing onto the floor.
That's just that whole miniature society falling apart at the seams right there at the end.
Yeah, and that's what it is. Like, you're seeing one of the first losses, and then you're just seeing how fast it's all going.
And it's just really... Well, and then also doubled with it because you got the priest and he's reading the last rites over that stuff too, and it's just actually like, oh shit. Well, especially the story of Titanic, the most everyone, especially before the movie came out, was like, oh, it's all about women and children first. The sacrifice of all these rich white dudes. And also, it's a big tragedy that they pretty much stuffed third class down below decks until they drowned. And so at least within that, at least people, like, the tragedy of third class is still, like, part of the overall, like, the portrait of the Titanic in people's imagination. But it does suck that it's mostly like, yes, John Jacob Astor, he was a hero. Like,
Yeah.
he was a rich white guy.
And all the other narratives get ripped out. Like, I haven't seen it yet because I haven't managed to catch a digital screening in my time yet, but the documentary The Six came out, which was about the six of the, there were 8 Chinese passengers on Titanic and 6 survived the sinking.
Okay.
And it's about them and how basically after the sinking, they were just like ostracized, completely cut out. I think there was...
I'm surprised the
there was a whole
Carpathia
thing
picked them up. Like,
well,
Jesus.
the thing is, when they got into New York, this is me quoting from memory, but if I remember correctly, there was some mild debate as to whether or not they'd be allowed to disembark. Because there was a very strong anti-Chinese sentiment.
Like, yeah, exactly.
But at the time, there was a really, really strong anti-Asian, especially anti-Chinese sentiment.
Like, probably a decade or two after specifically the anti... Did you say they were specifically Chinese? Not that the 1912 really even matter as long as they were Asian. But, like, if they were specifically Chinese, too, because I know there was, like, specifically anti-Chinese immigration acts and stuff like that.
Yes. That's exactly what was going on at the time. Thank you for reminding me. But that was something that had gotten brought up. And again, until I had heard of that documentary, I hadn't even been aware. Outside of that one the one character that Cameron had who was Chinese in the film.
Is there? I didn't even know.
Apparently... There is one guy at one point in time as the sinking. You see him a couple times.
Maybe
and
I just never the
traditional.
Okay, yeah.
He's got the very traditional sort of like pony braid, and he's wearing glasses, and he's always looking at a translation book.
Okay, I'll keep an eye out for the next time I watch.
Yeah, he's meant to be a stand-in for like the Chinese survivors, but yeah, after the wreck, I haven't seen the documentary yet, and I don't know how it ends, but the trailer was really addressing how after this happened, they were just wiped from history, and many of their families didn't even know they had any relation to the Titanic because they just refused to acknowledge these survivors.
You said it's called The Sixth?
The Six, just SIX.
Okay.
But when you also think about it, there was just so many different people on there. Like there was a black man in his family who was in second class.
I was about to ask, were there any black people? Because I was thinking about if you remake if you do another Titanic movie anytime soon, you're gonna have to find a way for it so it's not just entirely just white people.
I don't know. I think yes, his name was Joseph LaRoche, and he was one of 3 Haitian passengers. Okay. Oh, no, he was one of 3 African passengers, but he himself was Haitian.
I was gonna say, if there's some Chinese, it makes sense there would be, like...
Mm-hmm. And the story around him is actually kind of famous because he put his pregnant wife and 2 children onto a lifeboat and said goodbye.
God damn.
Yeah. I know. And unfortunately, he didn't make it, but his wife and his children, they did. But his story was also, again... kind of erased until somewhat recently. I have to thank that TikTok guy, Raf Avila, for this, because I was watching on YouTube just a compilation of a bunch of his TikToks, and one of them just started, "Did you know there was a black man on the Titanic?" And it's like, no, tell me more. And a lot of his videos highlight these lesser-known passengers, and it's really interesting to see just how many people were just flat-out erased because they were the wrong ethnicity. Religion, skin color.
Like 100 years for so many of these stories to actually really begin to surface in any kind of like known kind of way too. Like, I mean, that's one benefit of the internet, that at least like even the downtrodden from 100 years ago could still have at least a little more of a voice than they had, back in the day. So
yeah, and those stories are important, and some people might be like, "Is that really important?"
No,
it's like yes, it is.
There's no one human story that's important than anyone else's.
Exactly, and it's also, when you think about it, there was only 3 people on this ship who are of African descent, and somehow we've only heard of 0 of them.
That's nuts.
Yeah, and it's that sort
of... Even if their story is
where...
they just got their family to a boat and drowned, or like...
I've heard that there are people who were genuinely upset to find out that Jack and Rose didn't exist.
I mean, is it better that he didn't exist versus he would have been real and died?
That doesn't occur to most people.
Still, it's so funny that I still see people who are surprised to find out that Titanic was a real thing. Like, that was like a joke when that movie came out, but that's still sometimes I see people being like, "Oh, I didn't realize that was based on true events." Like, how much you've never heard of Titanic, like, especially after the movie came out, like...
Yeah, before the movie, I'd give you a lot more credit.
Because at least it's kind of just like whatever, it's like Bigfoot, but like...
Well, it happened a long time ago. Who cares? Move on.
It was a long time ago, but yeah.
It was. And I think that some of these books pointed out that Titanic mania has come in waves over the years when a new thing comes out. And I think with the advent of the internet, too, it's helped because, you know, I remember when the movie came out, this was still in the era of, like, lining up for screenings. That it was
oh man,
a different
I already
time
forgot
to
about
see.
what going to movie theaters like after the pandemic. And
That,
stuff
it was
like
such
just
a
even
big
thinking about
deal. It
25
was
years ago, yeah.
Yeah, it was a huge deal to for these big blockbuster movies to come out. People would wait in lines. It was a really, really big thing.
Especially Titanic itself, because that was a movie everyone was waiting in line for like a year.
And it was, and yeah, because it kept getting delayed and it kept having budget problems. And there was then, we need more time, we need more money, we need more time, we need more money. Yeah. So it was hyping and hyping and hyping. And the closest thing I could describe it to for people was, do you remember Harry Potter midnight release parties at Borders?
Uh-huh.
That's what it reminds me of. Long built-up anticipation for something that you know is going to be impactful.
That's kind of the same era. That was, if anything, that Titanic stuff was kind of the Kickstarter of like, God damn, yeah. There was kind of, and like, it was also certain kind of, like, maybe for 6 or 7 years there was like an offline nerddom where you would, like, instead of just everyone just waiting for their books from Amazon, you would go to the bookstore. Shit, yeah.
And stand there and stare at the cashiers for a few hours.
Now, what are you gonna do? James Cameron kind of justifiably gets made fun of these days because I know he's, like, taken other writers to task for not being able to draw, not being able to write good, strong women. Because since he came up with Sarah Connor and the Terminator and created Rose Walker, Rose Dodds, what's her last name? Rose Dodds, whatever.
It's Dawson now.
It's Dawson now. I've seen a couple times he's been like, "Oh, no one can write a strong woman like I can," which is like, okay, no. James Cameron, calm the fuck down. But at least he did with Jack. Mm-hmm. He did Jack respects Rose enough to like give her own space, and he doesn't save Rose in every way a person could by just like running roughshod over her, like kind of like I'm doing in the conversation right now. But like, he's a respectful dude,
and that's really important. And again, going back to being a young girl and seeing a movie where a young girl / woman is making decisions and making healthy decisions was really good. Because that's not often what's presented. What often is presented is you're gonna fall in love with a bad guy, and you're gonna fix him because he loves you so much. And I've been in that kind of relationship where, I was with someone who has a genuinely good heart, but has other issues going on, and those were not things that I could fix. But because I saw he was a good person, I tried. And ultimately, that doesn't work always in real life. It does sometimes. Sometimes people genuinely find the will to change, but like it's not often that you get someone who's moody and brooding and neglectful and who stalks you in your bedroom to make sure you're asleep, Edward. And that's shown as romantic. It's like, oh, he cares about her. He just wants her to be safe, and that's just, oh, it's so sweet. It's like, no, that's not. He's taking her agency away. He is stalking her. He is making her decisions for her. And in this case, like when Jack comes to plead his case, be like, Rose, come with me. He doesn't say, no, you're wrong. You don't know what's good for you. I'm what's good for you. He doesn't do that to her. He makes this point. He's like, I like you a lot. And we have our problems, but I want you to be okay.
I was about to ask, is it because he's not actually initially attracted to Rose? And that like he only
I thought he was.
But I forgot the first time he literally sees Rose, he's like, oh yeah. So it's not like
he's staring so hard that Fabrizio does the woohoo and nothing happens.
Like, the two other guys are all like, "Holy shit! I guess this guy's heterosexual. I guess. Holy shit."
Right. It's like understood.
But I think that's one of the things. That's what I think I don't like about Jack. Not that I dislike, but like I wish Jack had a little bit more of a glimmer of like an interior life, other than just being like this perfect mate for Rose. Like, he's exactly what she needs right then at that moment. It would be nice if he was a little more... Right. There's just something, even just a line or two in the movie. Wouldn't even take that much. But, like, he's such a... Like, I have no problem with him being a perfect thing for Rose, but, like, he just feels almost like someone, like a guardian angel who showed up. But at the same time, if that's what women need in real life, like, I'm glad that people like that. I'm glad that, like, at least Jack could be that for so many women watching that movie. And if Jack, as a character, did anything to help out anyone in their private lives while watching that movie, then I'll take that over Jack having any kind of more interior life in that script. So,
and I think that that's part of why I maybe give it so many passes, because I'm keenly and acutely aware of how relationships are shown to, especially women. Like, again, I'm talking in just general spheres of, you know, gender and what have you, but how that narrative is just presented so often as the thing that happens is that you meet a guy and he's aloof and disinterested, but all of a sudden he starts behaving and he chills out, or he stops sleeping around and he chills out, like whatever the case is. And all these like rom-coms, etc., it's always this playboy. Yeah, but that's how it's presented. It's always like woman must melt man's heart, and to just have it the other way around, being like man pursues woman kindly, was nice, because he wasn't like grabbing her ass or like whistling or anything.
As much as he's just a good dude towards her.
He's
it's
just
not
listening.
even like he's making big overtures.
No.
Like, even when he gets to draw her naked, she's the one who has to make the first move. Like she's the one like, I want you to draw me wearing only this, and he's like,
Yeah.
That is.
And even before that, he wasn't paying attention. He was like, that fucking diamond, and she's talking, and he's like,
yeah.
No, and then she goes, wearing only this, and all of a sudden it's like, wait, what?
And even the nervousness where, like, you know, the famous thing where he accidentally says bed instead of couch, and just, like, all that stuff is just, like, that is very endearing, and, like, yeah.
It is.